Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to this mini series on mixing drums. If you were with us on the last video, I spent a lot of time kind of teaching what I would call a top-down approach to mixing drums. And all that really means is that we don't start the mix jumping into the weeds on, what kind of compressors and EQs and plugins and whatnot that we're using on the individual channels. But before we touch any processing, we're trying to just take a really natural approach to building a solid drum mix, right? Pushing the faders up, setting the pans the way we want. Overall, just getting a good blend from the microphones that are there, and then doing some processing on the actual drum bus itself. If we're doing some compression and some kind of tone sculpting on the overall drum bus, then maybe we get to do a little bit less on the individual channels. If the drums already sound punchy and tight and full and just sound good before we ever put processing on the individual channels, I would say, we're already a good percentage of the way there to having a finished mix. And we've done less work and we've spent less time making a ton of decisions about, should I grab an SSL channel strip on the drums versus an API? There's all of these things that we could all these decisions that we could try to make that, in my opinion, when you boil it all down, they don't matter that much if you, kind of lose the forest for the trees, if you will, right? So today, I do want to talk about some of that processing. So if you haven't watched the first video, I would really recommend going back and watching it, because obviously it's going to help give a little bit more context for some of the decisions that I am making today in this video. If you did watch that video, you'll notice that in the last video, there wasn't a ton of processing or really anything happening on the mix overall. The mix was very raw. I had just started that mix. So what you're going to see today now as I share my screen, you're going to see quite a bit of stuff that is happening. Still, in my opinion, a very non-plug-in heavy mix intentionally. That top-down process that I was taking with the mix is also the way that I like to, or that I was taking with the drum mix rather. That's also the way I like to approach the mix overall. You'll notice a lot of these channels have literally like one plugin on it. Now, mind you, that plugin might be an SSL channel strip where this one plugin is doing, a lot of filtering and compression and some EQ stuff. Like it's you can get a lot out of one plugin. That's why I'm a big fan of channel strips, because it allows us to do, quite a few different moves, make a few different decisions in one plugin versus like having, an individual EQ and an individual compressor and distortion or whatever. Now, again, I'm not saying that you can't do that. I'm just saying the more we get in the weeds with just plugin world, like obviously there's a million plugins out there. There's some really great stuff, and maybe some of you have kind of your secret sauce plugin, and that's great. I'm not against that. I'm just saying, to me, if you really want to live in the professional world as a mixing engineer, as a producer, or whatever your role is, especially the busier you get, the more projects you have coming in, the less time you can really afford to spend getting super in the weeds on stuff that's not going to really matter that much, right? Kind of the 80-20 rule. We don't want to spend 80% of our time doing something that's going to only account for 20% of our mix. We really want to spend our time making quick decisions. I believe that quick decisions are musical decisions. If you listen to good music, if you're familiar with your tools, essentially all you're really doing is taking your taste, right? Your taste for good music, and translating that into the box of colors, or the toolbox that you have, if you will, and using those tools to craft a great mix or a great production. And so, so today, what we're going to spend time talking about is specifically kick and snare. Kick and snare are the foundation of your mix for most genres and most songs. Obviously, like I said in the last video, it's all going to come down to serving the song, right? We're not trying to serve the kick drum. We're not trying to serve the snare. In fact, I would say whenever I was younger and just kind of getting started in the world of mixing and production, I would spend hours sometimes trying to craft the right kick and snare sound. And then whenever I would unsolo the drum kit or the snare drum, you can't even hear it in the mix because I'm not making decisions at that point that serve the song. I'm just going through, 100 gigabytes of snare samples and sounds or kick samples and just trying to grab the one that I think sounds cool. And we don't want to take that approach, right? That to me can be quickly one of the biggest wastes of time. I'm not saying that it's not important to get the right kick and snare tone. Obviously, we could do a whole different video talking about the producer side of that conversation where, we're talking about recording and picking out the right microphones, picking out the right, kick and snare. That's not this video. This video is more from the perspective of as a mixing engineer, when you get sent files and you don't get to make those decisions, how do we then make decisions based off of like what kick and snare samples do we want to use, if we do we want to use any at all, and in doing so, how do we make decisions that really serve the song and not just sound cool, right? So anyway, let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen with you here, and if you notice, like, obviously there's more processing happening now than there was whenever I first showed you the mix. In that previous video, the mix really was just kind of a rough balance of the overall mix of the song. Since then the song has been finished. It's been sent to the artist. There's been some rounds of revisions. Like it's a finished song at this point, right? And so now I get to kind of go back and show you some of those decisions that I did make. And hopefully explain kind of my thought process behind making those decisions. So I'm going to start by playing you a little clip of the song. You can kind of see where the overall mix is, and then we're going to jump into kick and snare world. Here we go. Yeah, so hopefully you can hear, like, the mix is full. It sounds huge. Guitars are blazing, bass, everything sounds really good and full. But if you notice, the kick and snare really punch through, but not because it's just super loud, right? I want those things to punch through because, like I've said, they're really the foundation, even stylistically, of the mix itself. But it's also not the most important thing in the mix. I would say that the vocals are the most important thing. And if you'll notice, I don't have the vocals unmuted in this song because the song is not out yet. And so I like to kind of, just out of privacy or discretion, kind of save the vocals for when the song's out, just on behalf of the artist. That's not necessarily something that somebody's asked me to do, but it's kind of just more a courteous, an act of courtesy, I guess. So you also have to think the finished song obviously has vocals, and that's a different conversation. And we'll approach that conversation whenever I'm going to do a series about just mixing in general, kind of zoom out from the drums and focus on the overall mix. So I don't want to get into that now. So leave that in context. That to say, I would say that vocals are the most important thing in the mix. And then maybe second to that would be kick and snare. It's obviously subjective to the song you're working on. Some songs might not even have drums in it, and that's obviously a different approach. So as it pertains to this is, kind of more of a big, like, rock/worship mix. It's a big band, it's lots of guitars, lots of, cool synths and things like that. And so when you have a huge mix like that, getting the kick and snare to stand out and to serve their purpose without having to push them too hard or just rely on volume alone, that's what we're talking about today. That's kind of the magic trick, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and share, this mix window again, and we're going to kind of look at what processing we have going on here. So I showed you kind of the overall mix. You'll notice I've got some different things happening here now that I did not have in the previous video. I've got a drum bus, which we did talk about in the last video. I've got a para drum bus or a parallel drum bus, and all that's really happening there is there's some distortion, saturation stuff happening on that. Then I've got this drum verb channel, and then I've got this drum master. And essentially what the drum master is doing is it's just taking all of these other kind of buses that are happening and summing it to a drum master so that we can actually address kind of our overall post-processing. There's still a little bit of processing happening, but it's pretty sparse. Like you'll see, I've got a little bit of a shaping EQ happening here. But yeah, just kind of like one last step of processing, one last step of collecting those buses, where we can control our overall volume in the mix, right? So these things are happening. This is affecting the sound that you're hearing. But let's go ahead and let's solo the drums, and you can kind of hear some of the processing that's happening. Yeah, so really punchy kick and snare. I really like the way that this has turned out. The artist is obviously happy with the mix. They like where things landed. And yeah, and so this is a good spot to be in, where again, there's still not a ton of stuff happening. You'll notice, and some people would think this is kind of crazy, but I don't really have any processing happening on the overheads. I don't really have any processing happening on the room. Guys, there's stuff that you could do to that, right? I'm not saying don't process these channels. I'm saying that we really need to ask ourselves, why are we doing something? Why are we grabbing an EQ or a compressor? And if we don't have a good reason for that, then maybe we just shouldn't do that. And that's also not to say that I wouldn't do processing on these channels. Typically what I would do is at least do some filtering on those channels. And for whatever reason in this mix, I chose not to. Now I will say, like, you might ask, like, well, why don't you at least have some filtering happening on the overheads? Like, well, because I have some filtering happening here on the drum bus, right? We're filtering out some of that low boomy stuff. I'm also filtering out a little bit of that muddy, frequency range, which I believe we talked about in the last video. And because of that, if I turned all those things off, maybe I would have to go to my individual overhead channel and make some adjustments and do some filtering and stuff like that. But because we took the top-down approach, it's actually allowing me to do a little bit less processing, because we've already shaped the overall drum sound, and obviously I'm happy with the result that I've gotten. And so I don't really need to do a ton of individual processing on some of these channels, which I love, because to me it saves us brain power, and it also saves us it can save us from getting so in the weeds with the mix that it starts to feel like everything is just processed, right? So anyway, so let's listen first here to the kick. Right, so you'll notice here, I've got this kick trigger channel, and obviously I am doing, more processing on this kick trigger channel. I've got the kick essentially being sent to what you would, depending on your DAW, it'd be considered an aux or a bus. I just always call them buses. Some DAWs, I think, might read that a little bit differently. But essentially all we're doing is we're sending a direct copy of our kick in mic to a kick trigger channel. It's a bus. And you'll notice that we've got it set on pre-fader, which just means we can do whatever we want to this actual volume fader that's sending that kick, telling us how loud that kick mic is going to be in the overall mix. We can do whatever we want to that, because it's sending an unprocessed signal, or essentially a pre-volume fader signal to this bus that we set up. So I am still using some of this individual kick mic. If you noticed, or if you remember in the last video, I talked about how before relying on drum triggers, we really want to have hopefully a great sounding drum kit, great sounding performance. Like, instead of just relying on processing, we really want to have those things right. If we have influence in that, if you're producing and mixing the song, then usually you have the ability to make those decisions. If you're just mixing, you might have to rely more on drum triggers and things like that to make decisions, because maybe you don't have access to that conversation with the producer about, maybe it's not your role. Maybe that's not your role in the production. And that's where drum triggers and things like that are really handy, because you can shape that sound quite a bit without, getting to be involved in the recording side of that. So anyway, I am sending the kick drum to a kick trigger. And here's kind of the main reason why. It's not because this kick mic, I'm going to solo it. Right? Like the kick drum, the kick mic, kick in, it doesn't sound bad. I think it sounds great. And there is some processing that's happening, but really quite a bit of what I'm getting from that signal is this really attacky, inside kick sound, which is very useful in the right spot in the mix. But ultimately, it's not the main drum sound I want to rely on. And then secondly, there's going to be still quite a bit of bleed from the other drums in that microphone. So there are some ways around that. There's some cool plugins now that are like really intelligent drum gates. And sometimes I'll use those. But honestly, again, trying to make quick decisions, it's a lot faster. Instead of tweaking a drum gate, for me, it's a lot faster sending it to this bus and relying a little bit heavier on the actual drum trigger. So here's what our drum trigger sounds like. Just a nice punchy sounding kick drum sound. Now you notice I have this before the trigger here. I've got this Attacker Plus plugin, and all it is, it's a transient shaper, and you'll notice we're like raising the attack quite a bit, but you're not going to hear that in the processing. What it's actually doing is it's kind of taking our signal from this kick in mic and basically just shaping it to a much tighter transient, which actually kind of helps on the timing of how that trigger sample is firing. It's not shaping the sound, it's just shaping. I'll show you. Here's that signal coming in without. And then when we turn it on, you notice how this transient kind of got tighter. It's quite a bit louder. It just helps to shape it a little bit. And so that's kind of like step one whenever I'm triggering a kick like that. And then you'll notice here, I've got this cool sample. This is from the guys at Drum Sample Shop. I believe this is part of the Joe Carroll. This Joe Carroll kit, which is really cool. This video is not sponsored by them, but I do use their stuff all the time. It sounds awesome. So shout out to those guys. But yeah, it's just a really good sounding, simple mono kick sample. It sounds good. It sounds punchy. So I'm just grabbing that guy. And then I'm essentially taking this SSL channel strip. Again, I love working with channel strips. You'll notice here, I'm boosting around 50 hertz of the low end, just kind of helping it just feel a little bit punchier and rounder at the bottom of our mix. I've got about, about -7 dB, 7.5 dB. It's not an exact science. It's mix with your ears, don't mix with your eyes. Use your meters, but not for making all of your decisions, right? And we're just taking out, 300 hertz or so of that kind of low mid range, and it just helps shape it up a little bit. Taking out a little bit of that beater sound in that sample, and then just again further rounding it off a little bit. For this specific song, I don't want a super attacky kick drum sound. I want it to be more of like a low punchy kind of pulse that's happening, like kind of our heartbeat to this song. But we do want to have some attack in it so that we don't lose it in the mix. Because you'll see I'm actually rolling quite a bit of high end off of this sample. And then I'm adding quite a bit of compression here just to get a really nice and tight kick drum sound. And so you might ask, well, where are we getting our attack from? Well, that's where we have this guy back in, right? So we're still having that actual microphone sound in there. And then we've got this kick out sound. The kick out is just this nice kind of round, punchy, almost the pillowy air sound that happens when that microphone's backed off from the kick drum port, and it's just kind of capturing the low end buildup from that kick, right? It's capturing a lot more of the air that's being pushed from the actual kick drum. And I love blending the three of those things, because we've got like our sample is giving us kind of that foundational, meaty, punchy kick drum sound. The kick out mic is giving us more of that pillowy low end kind of sub frequencies. You could also replace that, or sometimes in the mix somebody will send you a sub kick instead of a kick out, and that's kind of a cool thing. It's just going to give us those real low subby frequencies. And then, we've still got this kick in mic that's giving us more of that attack. And so when you have all three together, again, in the context of the overall drum mix, You've still got this real nice round punchy kick sound, but you still have enough attack. So that's where just playing with, again, there's no exact science to it. It's more so just kind of playing with the relationship between these different microphones and this kick sample is going to get us to that place. And then another thing that you can do, you'll notice I've got this boom plugin on here. All it's doing is adding more of that kind of subby frequency. It kind of splits the difference between what an actual sub kick would do versus it's a little bit different than just turning up an EQ knob and just getting this super boomy low end sound, even though it is called boom. I think it's actually adding a little bit of saturation. It's adding, I don't want to get into the weeds here with exactly the science behind what it's doing because I don't fully understand that. I just know that it sounds cool. And what it's doing is basically it's adding more of like the harmonic information of the low end versus just turning up the low frequencies. It's probably doing a little bit of that too. It's actually got this drive knob too that's pretty cool that can further help that kick kind of live where you want it to in the mix. So notice we've got the output turned down some because we want to, as we're adding information, we want to make sure that we're not just making it louder, but we're actually processing the drum itself. So yeah, so that's the kick sound. Nice and punchy. Yeah, let's move on to the snare sound. So again, got some different decisions being made here. So same concept. We've got our snare mic, our actual snare top mic. We've got our bottom snare, and we've got a snare trigger sending it the same way, pre-fader. It's the same kind of thing, but obviously just as it pertains to the snare drum. And we've got the Attacker Plus plugin, basically just doing the exact same thing. And then we're grabbing this snare. I'm going to mute this snare verb. I think I might want to talk about the verb in a different video, focus more on drum effects, because there's a little magic trick that I'm doing here. I don't want to give too much away yet, but there's a cool way that I like to get a really natural snare reverb sound without fully just relying on a reverb plugin. So we'll talk about that later, but as it is, you'll hear... Yeah, here's our snare sound, again, using one of those Joe Carroll from one of the Joe Carroll samples from Drum Sample Shop. But you'll notice they've got this cool feature here. Not all samples are like this. Some of them are. A lot of the Drum Sample Shop guys, like a lot of their sample packs have this feature, and I think it's really brilliant. There's this articulation setting on the Steven Slate Trigger plugin. And with their sample packs, they've got like a close mono snare. Again, I need to mute our drum verb so there's no... There we go. Now it's just totally dry. So we've got like this close mono thing going on. There's a natural sound. Just has a little bit more life to it. Then they've got these rooms. It's a room mid and a room far, right? So the one I'm using for this song, it's just the big stereo sound. To me, it sounds like it's kind of a blend of all of those, or like a cool blend of all the mics that are available. It's kind of pre-mixed, if you will. I don't always do that, but with this specific song, it requires kind of a really big drum sound, and so I do like that one. Yeah, so again, SSL channel strip on this guy, and what we're doing here, you'll notice I've got about 7.8 dB. Again, it's not an exact science. I've got some low end. It's really more like the bottom part of the low mids, around that 200 hertz range. It's not subby information. It's like, it's just more of just kind of that meaty. If I turn this guy all the way up, it's just going to add that depth, that meaty, punchy low end of that snare. I really like that. And then we're doing, up here, probably around the same in the high end. It just helps it to cut through the mix a little bit. We don't want to add too much high end because then it might start sounding kind of thin. But yeah, we're just helping it cut through the mix a little bit. But you'll notice once again, there's not a ton of processing happening. We're not trying to, we don't want to just be in problem solving mode, right? Like I'm not trying to, and thankfully this is where relying on samples, does come in handy because, the samples are recorded in a great room, great drum sounds. So we're not trying to like get the boxiness of the room out necessarily because the samples already sound pretty good. So again, going back to what I said in the first video, like having a great drum recording makes such a massive difference. Like, I could do a whole other video series on how to rescue crappy sounding drums. That's not this. This is again working with good sounding drum recordings, great drummers. Like this is a good place to start for just kind of approaching a mix, and not necessarily like how to survive really bad recordings. That's a whole other series. And thankfully that's not the scenario we're in. So you'll notice again, I've got a little bit of that, low end information rolled off with this filter here, moderate compression. We could crank that compressor if we wanted to. It's gonna start sounding smashed. So again, we're just lightly grabbing some compression there. You could also put this link mode on, which is gonna, my opinion, I don't know exactly. I mean, I know what it's doing. It's essentially just linking both the left and right channel together. My ears would say when I click the link button, it kind of tightens the stereo image some. Somebody could fact check me on that. That's what I hear it doing whenever, like, why would you use that versus not use that? Since the sample has quite a bit of like room and kind of like this airy stereo sound to it, I'm probably not going to use that in this because I don't want to tighten it too much. But it is nice sometimes if you need some help getting that snare to just kind of feel like it's right in the middle of your mix. I do like doing that sometimes. So that's of course an option. And our compressor setting, notice we don't have the fast knob engaged. It's a little bit more of a slower compressor sound where it's kind of allowing that transient to cut through before grabbing it. And you can honestly do that with any plugin. Again, these are not magic settings. This is not a preset that's going to give you perfect snare sound. It's always going to come down to the individual song and the individual instrument that's being recorded. The frequency range is going to vary depending on what the source is. But this is kind of, I would say, the majority of mixes that I'm going to do they're going to look similar to this, not identical, but the function of like, I want to add some kind of punchy stuff, in that low end to the snare. And I also want to add a little bit of high end to make it cut through. But again, one of the reasons that we don't have to do a ton of stuff is because we did more of our processing on the actual drum channel, the drum bus rather, than we have. So we don't have to rely so much on the individual channels. So again, some of that high-end information is coming from this guy. Remember what we did? We added some air to the overall drums. We added some subbiness to the overall, low end, and we brought some high frequency back in. And again, it doesn't have to be this specific plugin. It can be any plugin, but it's just kind of the workflow that I like to have. Some of our compression and punchiness is coming from this attacker on the drum bus. Some of it's coming from this actual, bus compressor on the drum bus. So again, it's allowing us to do a little bit less heavy lifting on the actual individual channels, which is my preference. Because again, we get to do less and make quick decisions, musical decisions, versus like have to go super deep on every single channel. And ultimately, sometimes that gets us in the weeds where maybe we're not even making good decisions at all. So anyway, that's kind of the snare sound here. If we listen to that bottom snare, here's the relationship between the snare top and bottom snare without the trigger. And again, you might ask, like, well, why are you using snare samples if in the first video we talked about how it's important to bring out the realness of the actual kit? Like, that's a great point. But what I would say is one of the benefits to using samples, even if like, a lot of times I'm trying to match the drum sample, I'm trying to match it kind of with the actual vibe of the real recorded snare. But we've still got bleed in that channel. And so once again, like, if I start processing, like, I'm just going to grab this top snare, for instance, and let's throw the SSL channel strip on there. If I want to bring out some of the high end on that snare channel, the top snare mic. Notice what you hear. Now you've got quite a bit of bleed from the hi-hat. Now again, this is exaggerated. This is pushing the gain all the way up on that individual frequency band. And again, this is a good recording. This is really great. I like the tone. So I'm not saying that you couldn't do this, but one of the benefits of relying more on the snare sample is that we lose all of the bleed and we don't have to try to do a bunch of magic tricks to get the snare, the top snare mic sounding the way that we want it. I'm not saying that I wouldn't push that snare mic up in certain moments, especially if there's like, some rim clicks, or some like, super nuanced things. I wouldn't necessarily use a trigger, if we had brush sounds in the song. But yeah, as it pertains to this, like we could try to make this snare sound really usable. And honestly, it doesn't sound bad, but again, the more that we process it, the more that we're actually processing and pulling out some of the drum bleed that we hear in that recording. And so ultimately, again, trying to work quickly, it's pretty quick and easy just to send this guy to this snare trigger. And then what we get is we get the nuance from that from that drum recording. We get some of those ghost notes and things from the bottom snare. So you can still hear the rattle and some of like the articulation from the snare drum. You can still hear that in the bottom snare channel. So again, I'm not saying this is the way. I'm saying this is my approach to it, and kind of explaining the mentality behind it. And honestly, sometimes this changes per song. Like I said, I want to approach this song. I don't want to just approach, here's my preset to mixing the perfect snare sound. Like that's not what this video is. It's more of just the mentality of how do we approach the kick and snare. And so, so again, like I said, I'm going to save the magic trick of what we're doing on the snare verb, because that is quite a bit of the drum sound. I would also say, if we weren't going to use a sample on this, kind of as our main foundational snare sound, there's some tricks that we could do with the snare reverb that would allow this direct mic sound to still have kind of the roominess, the breathiness of that stereo verb. So there's some little tricks and things that we could do there, but ultimately for this mix, what I'm relying on is more of that snare sample, and then we're gluing the whole drum sound together by using the overheads in the room. So that's why it doesn't just sound like, obviously you can make it start sounding really kind of robotic and synthetic if you're relying more on the kick and snare sample than you are the rest of the kit. But that's the beauty of having, if we kind of bring everything back in here. We've got that direct punchy sound coming from our triggers, but we still have so much of the real kit sound coming from these overheads, coming from the room, and it just kind of helps to glue it all together. But again, going back to the first video, this is why mixing from the top down makes such a difference, because we're not relying on samples to get, the majority of our drum sound. It's kind of like we're actually getting a lot of our drum sound, especially the image. We're getting that from the overheads and from the room mics. And then still from some of the individual mics. Like I've got some stuff happening here with, again, not any real processing happening. Looks like I did try like a little trick with a delay, but ultimately decided against it. Because once again, it's like, to me, simple is better. As it pertains to this song, there are other scenarios where I would like go crazy on some of the effects on like the knee mic or like a mono overhead. Like there are some little tricks and things I like to do, but that would be more for like a pop song or for more of like a folk, indie rock kind of song where you want much more of an affected drum kit sound, versus with a big worship or like big rock mix. I'm typically going to approach it as holistically as possible, where I just want it to sound like a massive drum kit recorded in a great room that's punchy and just sounds huge. But again, I like it to feel like there's a life and breath and musicality in it, not this kind of choked, over-processed drum sound. So anyway, for today, that's kind of my approach as it pertains to this song. Like maybe I'll do another video series that's specific to a genre where we're gonna affect the drums quite a bit more. The next video that I want to do, which I'll release that one after this, is I do want to talk about some of my approach with the effects, because again, the drum effects, the verb, the parallel processing and distortion and overall reverb on the drum kit, those things are going to make a huge difference in the final tone of our drums, especially as it pertains to where it sits in the mix. If I was to play the mix and mute some of these other channels, you're going to notice that the drums feel very different than after we've added these effects in. And so be sure to watch that next video. For now, that's all that we're going to talk about here with the kick and snare. Please, if you have any feedback, any comments, any questions, I would love to answer those. And even if there's some questions that you feel like were not answered in this video, I would love to know in the comments, because maybe I can address some of those in the next video. So for now, that is my approach with this song to kick and snare. And again, less is more. I don't think that you have to over process to get a killer mix. A lot of these guys that approach a mix as kind of like science first, to me, I'm okay with that. Obviously, the end result, if the mix sounds awesome, then great. But I think that you can save yourself a lot of stress in how you get to that point. If your goal or if your mentality approaching it is to do the least amount of processing possible, I think that you end up with a much more natural musical feeling result. I think that the human ear and maybe even the human soul can hear and feel when something feels overly processed, because I think we're used to hearing music. Like I think that's why we like going to live, concerts, live shows. It's like when you hear the sound of guitar amps and drums and stuff in a room, even if it's not a massive room, it's like it just does something to your soul. There's a realism that happens there. And so if that serves the song well, I want to kind of approach it like that, versus how do I take this thing and just dramatically change it into something else. I want it to still feel natural and open, and like there's breath and life happening, musicality happening, instead of if you can't answer the question of why you're putting that plugin on that channel, then you probably shouldn't do it. You probably need a really good reason. At least that's my approach. And so for me, this is kind of my approach. I'm not saying that it's the only approach. I would love to hear in the comments if you have a different approach. If you disagree with me, I'd love to know. And if you have any questions, I would also love to know those questions, because maybe I can answer them in the next video. So stick around for the next video coming soon in this series, where we're going to talk about drum effects, some of the little magic trick things that you can do to help your drums sit right in the mix. As always, please like, share, subscribe, anything that you can do. It helps get this content further, because my goal is to help people. It's to help answer some questions. I know that when I first got started with this, it was videos like this that felt like almost a lifeline in a way. There's lots of information online, and so my goal is to help kind of present this in an organized way, and maybe a stress relieving way, where you get to understand that I'm not trying to sell you a plugin. I'm not trying to just say you have to have this magic whatever plugin, this one knob plugin that's going to dramatically make your drum mixes different. Like, I'm not saying that those don't exist, but I think that learning the foundational things first, the approach to these things, is going to help you way more than just grabbing a new plugin or whatever. So anyway, I hope this has helped. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.